The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Campbell as Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez approached the physical training field. Her military boots made steady sounds on the concrete path. Other soldiers were already stretching and preparing for the daily PT session that would test their strength and endurance. Elena walked slower than usual, her left arm held close to her body. The familiar ache in her shoulder reminded her of that terrible night in Afghanistan 2 years ago. She had been serving as a combat medic when her convoy hit an improvised explosive device. The blast had thrown her against the armored vehicle, leaving her with injuries that still caused her pain. Captain Harlan Brooks stood at the front of the formation, his stern eyes scanning the group of soldiers. He was known throughout the base for his tough attitude and high expectations. The captain believed that every soldier should perform at peak physical condition, no matter what. He had little patience for what he called excuses or weakness. As the soldiers lined up for morning exercises, Elena took her position in the back row. She tried to stretch her injured arm, but the sharp pain made her wince. The doctors had told her that her shoulder would never be the same after the surgery. Metal plates and screws now held her bones together where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone. "Listen up, soldiers," Captain Brooks barked. "Today we're doing the combat fitness test. Push-ups, sit-ups, and a 2-mile run. I don't want to hear any complaints or sob stories. Every one of you signed up to be warriors, so act like it." Elena felt her stomach tighten with worry. She knew she would struggle with the push-ups because of her shoulder injury. The physical therapy had helped, but she still couldn't lift her arm above her head without severe pain. She had a medical profile that allowed her to do modified exercises, but she had never shown it to Captain Brooks. When the command came to begin push-ups, Elena dropped to the ground with the others. She tried to lower herself down, but her left shoulder immediately sent shooting pain through her body. She could only manage a few partial push-ups before she had to stop, breathing heavily from the effort and pain. Captain Brooks noticed immediately. He walked over to where Elena was struggling on the ground. His face showed anger and disappointment as he looked down at her. The other soldiers continued their exercises, but many stole glances at what was happening. "Vasquez, what's wrong with you?" the captain demanded. "Are you even trying? This is pathetic. I've seen recruits perform better than this on their first day." Elena tried to continue, but her shoulder wouldn't cooperate. She attempted another push-up, but collapsed halfway down. Sweat beaded on her forehead, not from exertion, but from the intense pain shooting through her arm and back. "Sir, I have a medical condition that affects my ability to do standard push-ups," Elena said quietly, trying to maintain her military bearing despite the embarrassment she felt in front of her fellow soldiers. Captain Brooks's expression grew even more stern. He had heard similar statements from soldiers before, and he usually dismissed them as attempts to avoid hard work. In his experience, most soldiers who claimed medical problems were simply looking for an easy way out of physical training. "A medical condition?" he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Let me guess, you have a hangnail or a headache. Maybe your back hurts from sleeping on the wrong pillow." Some of the other soldiers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension in the air. They knew Elena as a dedicated soldier who had served overseas. But they also knew Captain Brooks's reputation for being harsh with anyone he perceived as weak or making excuses. Elena felt her cheeks burn with shame and frustration. She wanted to explain about Afghanistan, about the explosion, about the months of surgery and rehabilitation, but military protocol required her to show respect to her commanding officer, even when he was being unfair. "Sir, I have documentation from the medical staff regarding my limitations," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil she felt inside. Captain Brooks crossed his arms over his chest and shook his head. He had made up his mind about what he was seeing. To him, this looked like another soldier trying to get out of doing her fair share of the work. The morning air grew thick with tension as the confrontation continued. Other soldiers had stopped their exercises to watch what was unfolding. Elena remained on the ground, unable to continue the push-ups, but also unable to fully explain her situation without seeming to make excuses. Captain Brooks looked down at Elena with growing impatience. He had been in the military for over 20 years, and had seen countless soldiers try to avoid their duties with various complaints and medical claims. In his mind, Elena was just another soldier looking for an easy way out of physical training. "Documentation," he said with a harsh laugh. "I don't care about your paperwork, Vasquez. What I care about is results. Either you can do the job or you can't. Right now, it looks like you can't." Elena struggled to get back to her feet, her injured shoulder throbbing with each movement. She could feel the eyes of her fellow soldiers watching her, some with sympathy and others with curiosity. She had always been proud of her military service and her ability to perform her duties, but now she felt humiliated in front of everyone. The captain continued his verbal assault, his voice growing louder so that everyone on the training field could hear. "This is exactly what's wrong with today's military. Soldiers think they can show up and do the minimum. They want special treatment for every little ache and pain." As he spoke, Elena remembered the night that had changed everything for her. She could still hear the sound of the explosion that had ripped through their convoy in Afghanistan. She remembered waking up in the military hospital, unable to move her left arm. The doctors had told her she was lucky to be alive, but sometimes she wondered if lucky was the right word. "I've been doing this job longer than some of you have been alive," Captain Brooks continued. "I've seen real warriors, soldiers who fought through actual injuries to complete their missions. They didn't make excuses or ask for special treatment." Elena felt anger rising in her chest. She had fought through real injuries. She had saved lives while her own body was broken and bleeding. She had earned every medal and commendation on her uniform through sacrifice and courage that this captain couldn't even imagine. But military discipline held her tongue. She stood at attention, her jaw clenched while the captain continued to belittle her in front of the entire formation. The pain in her shoulder seemed to intensify with her emotional stress, sending sharp jolts down her arm. "Let me tell you something, Vasquez," the captain said, stepping closer to her. "I don't care if you have a doctor's note saying you can't do push-ups. I don't care if you have some story about getting hurt. What I care about is whether you're going to be useful to this unit or just dead weight." The other soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Many of them knew Elena's reputation as a combat medic who had served with distinction overseas. They had heard stories about her bravery under fire and her dedication to saving wounded soldiers. But they also knew better than to speak up against a captain during a public confrontation. Elena's hands began to shake with a combination of anger and adrenaline. She thought about all the nights she had spent in physical therapy, working to regain even partial use of her shoulder. She remembered the surgeries, the infections, the months of recovery. She thought about the soldiers whose lives she had saved while her own body was breaking apart. Captain Brooks seemed to interpret her shaking as fear or weakness. His expression grew even more contemptuous as he prepared to deliver what he thought would be the final blow to her credibility. "You know what I think, Vasquez? I think you're a coward. I think you're using some made-up medical excuse to avoid doing your duty. I think you're exactly the kind of soldier who gives the rest of us a bad name." The word coward hit Elena like a physical blow. She had been called many things in her military career, but never that. She had run toward danger when others ran away. She had put her own life at risk to save others. She had earned the respect of every soldier she had served with through her courage and dedication. Something inside her snapped. She had tried to handle this situation with dignity and respect for military protocol. She had attempted to explain her limitations without going into the painful details of her injuries. But being called a coward by someone who had never seen real combat was more than she could bear. The training field fell silent except for the sound of Elena's heavy breathing. The morning sun continued to rise, casting longer shadows across the ground where dozens of soldiers stood frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension in the air was so thick it seemed almost solid. Captain Brooks stood with his arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on his face. He believed he had won this confrontation and put an insubordinate soldier in her place. He expected Elena to apologize, make more excuses, or simply walk away in defeat. But he had no idea what Elena was about to do next. Elena stood perfectly still for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. The word coward echoed in her mind, stinging worse than any physical pain she had endured. She looked directly into Captain Brooks's eyes, and for the first time since the confrontation began, her expression changed from respectful submission to something else entirely. Without saying a word, Elena reached up and began to unzip her military PT jacket. The sound of the zipper seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the training field. Captain Brooks watched with confusion, not understanding what she was doing or why she was removing her jacket when he had been berating her. The other soldiers craned their necks to see what was happening. Some of them had served with Elena overseas, and they began to realize what she was about to reveal. Their faces showed a mixture of anticipation and dread, knowing that the captain was about to learn something that would change everything. As Elena pulled her arms out of the jacket sleeves, she winced slightly from the movement of her injured shoulder, but she continued with determined precision, folding the jacket neatly and setting it on the ground beside her. She now stood in her standard military PT shirt, a simple gray garment that she usually kept covered during physical training. Captain Brooks's confident smirk began to fade as he saw what was revealed on Elena's arms and shoulders. Through the thin fabric of her PT shirt, dark lines and patches were clearly visible across her skin. But these weren't tattoos or birthmarks. They were something much more significant. Elena then did something that shocked everyone present. She grabbed the bottom of her PT shirt and lifted it up, exposing her torso to everyone on the training field. The gasps and sharp intakes of breath from the watching soldiers were audible across the entire area. Her body told a story that no words could adequately describe. Surgical scars crisscrossed her shoulder and back in precise lines where military surgeons had worked to put her back together. But worse than the surgical scars were the other marks scattered across her skin. These were the unmistakable signs of shrapnel wounds, burn scars, and the devastating injuries that came from being too close to an explosion. The largest scar ran from her left shoulder blade down to her ribs, a thick, raised line of tissue that spoke of a wound that had nearly killed her. Smaller scars dotted her back and shoulder, each one a reminder of the metal fragments that had torn through her body when the improvised explosive device detonated under her convoy. Captain Brooks's face went completely white. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He had expected to see perhaps a small surgical scar or some minor injury that Elena was exaggerating. Instead, he was looking at the body of a warrior who had literally been torn apart by enemy fire and put back together through multiple surgeries. The training field was so quiet that the sound of wind through the nearby trees seemed deafeningly loud. Every soldier present was staring at Elena's exposed scars, understanding immediately what they were seeing. These were not the marks of someone who had avoided danger or looked for easy assignments. These were the battle scars of someone who had faced the worst that war could offer and survived. Elena stood straight and proud despite being partially undressed in front of dozens of people. Her scars caught the morning sunlight, making the raised tissue stand out even more dramatically against her skin. She looked directly at Captain Brooks, her eyes filled with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. "These scars are from Afghanistan, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I was serving as a combat medic with the 101st Airborne when our convoy hit an IED. The explosion threw me against our armored vehicle and filled my body with shrapnel." She turned slightly to show the full extent of her injuries, pointing to different scars as she continued. "This scar is where they removed a piece of metal that was inches from my heart. This one is where they reconstructed my shoulder blade after it was shattered. These smaller ones are from the dozens of metal fragments they pulled out of my back and arms." Captain Brooks stood frozen, unable to speak or move. He was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake, but the full weight of his error had not yet hit him. He was still processing the visual evidence of Elena's sacrifice and service. Elena continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The doctors told me I would never regain full use of my left shoulder. They said I was lucky to keep my arm at all. I spent 8 months in military hospitals and rehabilitation centers learning how to use my body again." The other soldiers began to murmur among themselves, some nodding with recognition and respect. A few who had served overseas had their own scars and understood exactly what Elena had endured. They knew the long road of recovery that followed such devastating injuries. "I didn't choose to get injured, sir," Elena said. still looking directly at the captain. But I also didn't choose to quit when it happened. I chose to fight my way back to active duty because I believe in serving my country and my fellow soldiers. The silence on the training field stretched on as Captain Brooks struggled to process what he was seeing and hearing. His face had gone from white to red as the full impact of his mistake began to sink in. He had just called a combat veteran a coward in front of dozens of soldiers. And now he was staring at the physical evidence of heroism and sacrifice. Elena continued to stand with her shirt raised, making sure that everyone could see the full extent of her battle wounds. She wasn't doing this for shock value or sympathy. She was making a point about service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of courage. Each scar on her body represented a moment when she had chosen duty over safety. On the night I was injured, Elena continued, her voice carrying across the silent training field, I was treating 3 wounded soldiers when the IED exploded. Even after the blast, even with my own injuries, I continued to provide medical care until the evacuation helicopters arrived. I saved 2 lives that night while pieces of metal were still embedded in my own body. Some of the soldiers who had served in combat zones nodded knowingly. They understood the chaos and terror of such moments when training and duty overcome pain and fear. They recognized the type of courage that Elena was describing, the kind that couldn't be faked or exaggerated. Captain Brooks finally found his voice, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. Staff Sergeant Vasquez. I didn't know. He trailed off, unable to complete his sentence. For the first time in his military career, he was completely at a loss for words. Elena slowly lowered her shirt, covering her scars but not the impact they had made on everyone present. She picked up her PT jacket and began putting it back on, each movement careful and deliberate. The pain in her shoulder was still there, would always be there, but she had made her point. Sir, I have never asked for special treatment, she said as she zipped up her jacket. I have a medical profile that allows for modified physical training exercises, but I continue to serve in every capacity that I'm able to. I've never used my injuries as an excuse to avoid my duties or responsibilities. The captain's hands were shaking slightly as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. He had publicly humiliated a decorated combat veteran based on his own assumptions and prejudices. Word of this incident would spread throughout the base within hours, and his reputation would never recover from such a serious error in judgment. Other soldiers on the training field began to shift and murmur among themselves. Many of them were looking at Captain Brooks with expressions that ranged from disappointment to outright disgust. They had just witnessed him call a genuine war hero a coward, and they would not forget it anytime soon. Sergeant First Class Thompson, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan himself, stepped forward from the formation. His movement broke the spell of silence that had held everyone frozen. Staff Sergeant Vasquez served with distinction in my unit overseas, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. She's one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to serve alongside. His words seemed to give other soldiers permission to move and speak. More voices began to rise from the formation, soldiers sharing their own knowledge of Elena's service record and character. The mood on the training field was shifting dramatically, and not in Captain Brooks's favor. She pulled me out of a burning vehicle in Kandahar, called out Specialist Ramirez. Carried me to safety even though she was injured herself. She saved my life twice in one deployment, added Corporal Hayes. Best combat medic in the whole theater of operations. Captain Brooks listened to these testimonials with growing horror and embarrassment. Each positive comment about Elena's service made his own behavior seem more inexcusable. He had been so focused on what he perceived as weakness that he had completely missed the strength and courage standing right in front of him. Elena stood quietly while her fellow soldiers spoke up on her behalf. She hadn't asked for their support, but she was grateful for it. These were the people who really knew her, who had seen her in action when lives were on the line. Their opinions mattered more to her than any criticism from someone who had never been tested in real combat. The morning sun continued to rise, casting new shadows across the training field. What had started as a routine physical training session had become something much more significant. It had become a moment of reckoning where assumptions were challenged and true character was revealed. Captain Brooks stood in the middle of it all, knowing that he had to say something to address what had happened. But he also knew that anything he said at this point would sound hollow and inadequate. He had revealed his own prejudices and poor judgment in the most public way possible. The damage was done, and there would be consequences that reached far beyond this single morning on the training field. Captain Brooks stood in the center of the training field, surrounded by soldiers who were no longer looking at him with the automatic respect that his rank usually commanded. Instead, their faces showed disappointment, anger, and loss of confidence in his leadership. He could feel his authority slipping away with each passing moment. The testimonials from Elena's fellow soldiers had stopped, but the damage to his reputation was clearly visible in every face around him. He had made a fundamental error in judgment, one that revealed serious flaws in his character and leadership ability. Military officers were expected to know their soldiers, to understand their capabilities and limitations, and to lead with wisdom and fairness. Elena finished adjusting her PT jacket and came to attention, waiting to see what the captain would do next. Despite everything that had just happened, she maintained her military bearing and showed proper respect for his rank. Her dignity in this moment made Captain Brooks's earlier behavior seem even more shameful in comparison. Staff Sergeant Vasquez. The captain began, his voice much quieter than it had been earlier. I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your situation without gathering the facts, and I spoke to you in a way that was completely inappropriate. His words were correct, but they sounded forced and hollow to everyone listening. Elena simply nodded in acknowledgement without speaking. She had achieved her goal of defending her honor and service record, but she took no pleasure in the captain's obvious discomfort. The other soldiers continued to watch this unprecedented scene unfold. In their collective military experience, none of them had ever seen a captain forced to publicly apologize to a lower-ranking soldier. The power dynamic on the training field had shifted completely, and everyone present understood the significance of what they were witnessing. Captain Brooks cleared his throat and tried to regain some measure of control over the situation. All soldiers will continue with the scheduled physical training exercises. Those with medical profiles should follow their modified routines as prescribed by medical personnel. But his attempt to return to normal operations fell flat. The soldiers began their exercises mechanically without the usual energy and enthusiasm. The incident had cast a shadow over the entire training session, and everyone could feel the tension that still hung in the air. As the morning progressed, word of what had happened began to spread beyond the training field. Soldiers talked during breaks, sharing the story with others who hadn't witnessed it firsthand. By lunchtime, everyone on the base had heard about Captain Brooks's confrontation with Staff Sergeant Vasquez and how badly it had gone for him. The story grew and evolved as it spread, but the core facts remained the same. A respected combat veteran had been publicly humiliated by a captain who had made false assumptions about her character and service. When she revealed her battle scars, it became clear that she had sacrificed more for her country than most soldiers ever would. In the base command center, other officers began to hear the reports of what had happened during morning PT. Colonel Ellis, the base commander, requested a full briefing on the incident. He had known Elena Vasquez by reputation as an outstanding soldier and medic, and he was deeply concerned about what he was hearing. Meanwhile, Elena returned to her regular duties, trying to put the morning's events behind her, but she found it difficult to concentrate on routine tasks. The confrontation had brought back memories of her time in Afghanistan, both the traumatic moments of her injury and the pride she felt in her service and sacrifice. Her fellow soldiers treated her with even more respect than usual, if that was possible. They stopped by her work area throughout the day to offer support and to share their own thoughts about what had happened. Many of them expressed admiration for the way she had handled such a difficult situation with dignity and courage. Captain Brooks, meanwhile, spent the day in his office with his door closed. He knew that his career had taken a serious hit, and he was trying to figure out how to repair the damage, but deep down he understood that some mistakes couldn't be undone. His poor judgment and prejudiced assumptions had been exposed in the most public way possible. By evening, the incident had reached the attention of military leadership far beyond Fort Campbell. Stories like this one had a way of traveling quickly through military networks, especially when they highlighted issues of leadership, respect for veterans, and the treatment of wounded warriors. The repercussions were just beginning to unfold, and they would extend far beyond a single morning's physical training session. What had started as a routine exercise had become a defining moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Elena went to bed that night knowing that she had stood up for herself and for all the soldiers who had been wounded in service to their country. She had shown that true strength wasn't measured by the ability to do push-ups, but by the willingness to sacrifice everything for duty, honor, and fellow soldiers. 2 weeks after the incident on the training field, the consequences of Captain Brooks's actions had rippled through the entire military chain of command. Colonel Ellis had completed his investigation into what happened, interviewing dozens of witnesses and reviewing Elena's complete service record and medical documentation. The investigation revealed that Elena Vasquez was not only a decorated combat veteran, but also one of the most highly regarded soldiers on the base. Her service record included 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star for valor, and commendations from multiple commanding officers who praised her dedication and heroism under fire. Captain Brooks was called into Colonel Ellis's office on a Thursday morning. The meeting was brief and direct. The colonel informed him that his behavior towards Staff Sergeant Vasquez was completely unacceptable and showed a serious lack of judgment and leadership capability. "Captain," Colonel Ellis said, his voice firm and disappointed, "your actions have damaged the morale and trust of the soldiers under your command. More importantly, you publicly humiliated a wounded warrior who has given more to this country than most people can imagine." The consequences were swift and severe. Captain Brooks was relieved of his command effective immediately and reassigned to a desk position pending an official review of his fitness for continued service. His military career, which had once seemed promising, was now effectively over. News of the captain's removal from command spread through Fort Campbell as quickly as the original story had. Soldiers throughout the base felt a sense of justice had been served, and their faith in military leadership was partially restored by seeing that inappropriate behavior had real consequences. Elena was called to Colonel Ellis's office the same day. She entered with some apprehension, unsure of what to expect from this meeting with such a high-ranking officer. But the colonel's first words put her at ease. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, I want to personally apologize for what you endured," Colonel Ellis said. "Your service and sacrifice deserve nothing but respect and recognition, not the treatment you received from Captain Brooks." The colonel went on to inform Elena that she was being considered for promotion to Sergeant First Class, recognizing both her outstanding service record and her grace under pressure during the difficult incident. He also mentioned that the Army was reviewing policies to ensure that wounded warriors received appropriate support and accommodation for their service-related injuries. In the months that followed, Elena's story became known throughout the military community as an example of true courage and dignity. She was invited to speak at military conferences about the challenges faced by wounded veterans and the importance of understanding and supporting soldiers who had been injured in combat. The incident also led to changes in how physical training was conducted on military bases. New guidelines were established requiring commanders to familiarize themselves with the medical profiles and service histories of their soldiers before making judgments about their capabilities or motivation. Elena continued her service with distinction, eventually earning promotion to Sergeant First Class and later to Master Sergeant. She became a mentor to younger soldiers, especially those who had been wounded in combat, helping them navigate the challenges of recovery and continued service. Years later, when Elena was asked about that morning on the training field, she would say that it was one of the most difficult but important moments of her military career. It had forced her to confront the prejudices and misunderstandings that wounded veterans sometimes faced, even within the military community itself. She never took pleasure in Captain Brooks's downfall, understanding that his mistake came from ignorance rather than malice. But she was proud that her actions had led to positive changes that would benefit other wounded warriors who came after her. The story of Elena Vasquez became a teaching tool in military leadership courses, illustrating the importance of knowing your soldiers, avoiding assumptions, and treating everyone with dignity and respect. It served as a powerful reminder that true strength comes not from physical perfection, but from courage, dedication, and the willingness to serve others. The scars on Elena's body never fully healed, and the pain in her shoulder remained a constant reminder of her service in Afghanistan. But those same scars had also become symbols of her courage and sacrifice, proof that she had earned the right to be called a warrior in every sense of the word. Her story inspired countless other veterans who struggled with both visible and invisible wounds from their service. It showed them that their sacrifices mattered, that their continued service was valued, and that they deserved respect regardless of the physical limitations their injuries might impose. The training field where it all began continued to be used for daily physical training exercises. But now it was also remembered as the place where a wounded warrior stood up for herself and all veterans who had paid the price of freedom with their blood, sweat, and sacrifice. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe, and drop your thoughts and comments.